So you should draw figures 8 heads tall, right? Oh no, wait, sorry. Draw them 7.5 heads tall, because that's closer to what a normal person is really like. Do you know what? Actually, forget that. Let's use the thirds system. Wait, how about this? This isn't a maths exam. Let's forget algebraic formulas and just learn to draw people by drawing actual people as we see them. Hi, my name's Kenzo, and this is Love Life Drawing. So I've seen all sorts of opinions about these standard proportions. So in this video, we're going to look through some of the main ones, talk about the problems with them, and talk about when to use them, and more importantly, when not to use them. Okay, go on. The most famous standard proportions or proportional canons are the head lengths for the whole figure. So for example, the figure is 8 head lengths tall. One head length down from the chin takes you to the nipples, then another to the belly button, another to the crotch. And no one ever says that 8 head lengths represents the average person. It's often described as a sort of superhero version of a human being. Another one is 7.5 heads, which might better represent what a person who, isn't Michael Jordan is like. And then another system involves cranium widths, or sometimes hand lengths instead of head lengths. The good thing about these is they tend to tell you about more structural skeletal points rather than surface stuff like the belly button and the nipples. So for me, there are some major problems with all of these systems. The first and most obvious is that people vary, and so these almost never actually apply to real people. When you measure real people, their head lengths are all over the place, so often between 6 to 8 head lengths, but also outside of that wide range as well. Now, to be fair, the standards are always intended to just be a starting point. It's always made clear that you have to modify them, but the thing is, they're just so often so far off. And as soon as you're not looking straight on at someone who is standing straight, it all kind of goes out the window. Foreshortening changes it, bending in the pose changes it, and so on. And that's the reason that I resisted learning any of these for a long time. There's a third, less obvious problem with these, which is a false sense of security and accuracy. And that gets worse the more detailed they appear to be. So when you're learning to draw, it's really hard and confusing, and proportions are one of the big problems. And you want some clear answers. You want some kind of secret that's going to help you solve this problem. And these ideas seem to present clear-cut answers, which is really enticing. And the more specific they are, the more they feel like scientific answers that are going to solve things for you. But they do have a role, but that's not the role they play. They can't do that for you. So let's look at some useful ideas, and then I'll tell you why I think they are useful. So the first one is just halves. The level of the pubic bone, or the greater trochanters, basically just above the crotch roughly, is about halfway down. So if you're putting figures into a landscape, it's great to keep that in mind. If you keep making the legs too short on your figures, this could help start to fix that tendency. Another really useful system is the thirds for the torso. From the top of the head to the collarbones is roughly similar to the collarbones to the bottom of the rib cage, and the bottom of the rib cage to just below the crotch. So you can kind of split the head and torso into thirds. So why do I like these two ideas, the halves and the thirds? Well, we love big and simple ideas here, right? And these are big and simple. They're very simple mathematically, and they're quite big scale, right? I have found that these ideas are also much more generalizable than the head length ideas. So when I look for halfway points on lots of different people, or when I look at those thirds, I find that they work with a lot more consistency than the head lengths did. And then rather than telling us about nipples and belly buttons, these ideas, the halves and the thirds, are really telling us about underlying skeletal structure, the collarbones, the rib cage, and so on. Another thing is that, the way I described them was pretty vague, right? Like roughly similar to. And I like that. I think that being vague with these in your mind is much better than giving yourself a false sense of accuracy. So when you get these ideas like, oh, this length is 2/3 the length of that, or that is 1.5 times the length of that, it really makes you think, oh, okay, I need to be accurate. I need to get this exactly right, like the rule. It feels like a rule. When you remember it with words like it's roughly similar to, a little bit smaller than, or a little bit bigger than, it's much more useful because that is more accurate actually. These are always quite vague ideas that vary a lot, and it's just going to get you into the ballpark. It's not going to be some kind of rule that you have to adhere to. So remember it with these kind of vague terms. One of the few times I think it's useful to actually get specific with some of these is when you're doing a basic anatomical diagram from your memory. I think it's quite a useful exercise to be able to draw a figure's structure from your memory just to help you remember and understand the structural forms of the figure. It's not essential and it doesn't have to be a huge part of your practice. We do have a diagram like this that we ask people to practice in our course Life Drawing Simplified. It's built around the thirds system, but it's not a huge part of the course. And I don't think it's essential to learn it, but I do see a lot of uses for it, so it's worth spending some time on. And when you do diagrams like this, you need some ideas for the proportions to help you with that diagram. So you understand that these proportions you're using aren't rules for when you're drawing real people, but they're just proportions that you're using to help you with your standard diagram that you're practicing. So ultimately, I just don't think that any of these systems is super important. So you could choose none of them, or you could choose one of them, and whichever one you choose, you're going to get to where you want to go either way, with none of them or with any of them. So my mum is amazing at life drawing and didn't study any of these formulaic ideas at the point where she was doing these drawings. She always wanted to find the interesting shapes that real people create with their poses, using as fresh an eye as she could. And I think that that mindset really comes out in her drawings. So I've seen artists who've used one of these systems, any of them, and become really good at drawing. I've seen other artists who never used any of these systems and really dislike them and become really good at drawing. And at the end of the day, what they all did was develop an intuitive sense of proportions. And that is, I think, the ultimate goal. So basically, you're able to look at a pose and you can see how far the leg should come down when you're drawing it. And you see it based on your experience and your muscle memory, just your eye. You eyeball it and you're able to see how far it should go. Your skill basically becomes better than your knowledge. Your muscle memory becomes better than any of these memorized ideas. And I think that there are 3 steps to building that intuitive sense of proportions. The first is you learn observational skills where you measure, right? You draw figures and you use measurement techniques. I'll leave a link below to which describes those measuring techniques. As you measure more and more, eventually you're going to be able to just eyeball your proportions without measuring them. That's the goal. The second thing is to learn to simplify the figure. When you learn to break things down into a few key points, a few forms and shapes, now you're just trying to relate a few simple things rather than trying to relate millions of things together in proportion. So the standard proportions that we looked at earlier can help with that simplification study, doing diagrams like the one that I was showing you earlier. But I don't think it's actually essential to it either. And then the third thing is self-assessment. You need to be able to assess your drawings and find your tendencies. Maybe you often make the head too big or the legs too short. Often people are drawing with the same proportional tendencies and mistakes, and so you can find those and start to address them. You know, these standard proportions, like I said, some of them, especially the thirds and the halves, they can be useful, but at the end of the day, drawing is much more like a sport than an academic subject. So you only get better by building your muscle memory and intuition through a lot of targeted practice, rather than memorization of formulas, right? A basketball player doesn't learn to play basketball by reading a book about basketball and remembering loads of formulas about basketball. So guys, we have a really useful guide to help you with your life drawing learning called Life Drawing Success. And you can also get our newsletter I spend a lot of time every week writing out tips and ideas about life drawing and sending them out in this newsletter. So sign up for that and the guide below. There should be some other awesome videos from us on the screen, probably about simplification. So check one of them out, and I'll see you next time.